Developing tonight, an historic drug bust, part of a nearly decades-long investigation with the FBI, right? And the director of the FBI says this is the largest takedown he's ever seen, and everyone should be paying attention.
I think you've seen the news this morning. The news is reporting that cartel drones are being shot down by our military.
A Green Lake County funeral home director is charged with selling illegal drugs out of her place of business.
This is exactly how you safeguard American lives. You go after the organizations that are inflicting pain across America.
They didn't just smuggle poison into our neighborhoods, they hid it underneath the cold, silent remains of our grandmothers, fathers, and children. The Gulf Cartel found the one place the law was too polite to look. Inside the caskets of the grieving, turning $890 million of death into a highway of human remains.
This is a huge amount that was seized by police.
Developing tonight, we are looking at a historic drug bust that feels more like a script from a horror movie than a police report. This was a decade-long investigation involving the FBI, and according to the director of the Bureau himself, this is the largest, most disturbing takedown he has ever witnessed. It's a story that every American needs to hear because it targets the one thing we all hold sacred, our respect for the dead. You've probably seen the headlines lately. Reports of cartel drones being shot down by our military at the border. But while we were looking at the sky, something much more sinister was moving on our highways. In Green Lake County, a funeral home director was recently charged with running a narcotics empire right out of her place of business. This is how you safeguard American lives, by going after the organizations inflicting pain across the heartland. The DEA just arrested 67 people connected to a massive trafficking network that used the funeral industry as a front to smuggle a literal tide of poison across state lines. They didn't just use trucks or hidden compartments in cars. They hid fentanyl, meth, and cocaine inside coffins, alongside actual human bodies. Before we dive into the chilling details of how they pulled this off, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We uncover the stories the mainstream media often skims over, and you won't want to miss our next deep dive. Imagine being a grieving family member. You think you're transporting your loved one to their final resting place. In reality, that casket contains 40 pounds of high-grade narcotics tucked under the lining. The Gulf Cartel effectively turned America's funeral industry into a smuggling highway, moving an estimated $890 million in illegal drugs under the cover of grief.
Deputies say they teamed up with the DEA, ATF, and Palm Bay police to confiscate 92,000 pounds of a substance used to make a drug known as 7-OH, a drug that's 3 times stronger than morphine.
Federal agents are calling it the most disturbing method they've ever seen. But how did it all come crashing down? It started with something as mundane as a traffic stop on Interstate 10 just outside El Paso, Texas. In September 2022, a Texas state trooper pulled over a black hearse. The reason? A minor traffic violation, failing to signal a lane change. The driver looked the part. Calm, professional, dressed for the job. He handed over paperwork showing he was transporting a deceased person from El Paso to Houston for burial. Everything looked legitimate. But the trooper had a gut feeling. You know that instinct? The driver was too nervous. His hands were shaking, he was sweating profusely, and he couldn't meet the officer's eyes. When asked basic questions about the deceased or the funeral arrangements, he was vague. He couldn't even remember the name of the funeral home he was heading to. When the trooper asked to inspect the vehicle, the driver refused. That was the red flag. A K9 unit was called in, and the drug dog alerted immediately to the rear of the hearse, right where the casket was secured. Now, the trooper was in a delicate spot. You don't just pry open a casket on the side of a highway. He called his supervisor, who called the DEA. Within 2 hours, agents and a medical examiner were on the scene. With the proper paperwork in hand, they opened the lid. Inside was an elderly woman, properly embalmed and dressed for her service, but hidden in a custom compartment beneath the silk lining, 38 pounds of fentanyl and 22 pounds of methamphetamine. The street value? $2.7 million. If you're finding this investigation as shocking as I am, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps us get these important stories out to more people. That single arrest blew the doors off Operation Final Passage. DEA Administrator Ann Milgram eventually announced the results. Over a 3-year period, the Gulf Cartel had used 23 funeral homes across 14 states as drug hubs. They seized 47 million fentanyl pills and nearly 10,000 kilos of fentanyl in total. We're talking about 340 caskets moving $890 million worth of drugs. That is 369 million potentially deadly doses. To put that in perspective, that's enough to kill every single person in the United States and still have doses left over. So, how did the scheme actually work? The cartel started by identifying funeral homes in border communities like El Paso, Laredo, McAllen, and Brownsville in Texas, as well as Yuma and Nogales in Arizona. They had a carrot or stick approach. First, they'd offer owners $50,000 per shipment. For a struggling small business, that's life-changing money. If the owners said no, then came the threats against their families. For the homes that couldn't be bought or bullied, the cartel just infiltrated them. They placed sleepers, cartel workers who got licensed as funeral directors, embalmers, and drivers. They passed background checks. They were legitimate professionals by day, cartel plants by night. The cartel even manufactured custom caskets in Mexico. From the outside, they looked like high-end standard models. But inside, they featured airtight, lead-lined compartments designed to neutralize odors and defeat drug dogs. As we saw on ID10, the system wasn't perfect, but it worked 340 times before they got caught. The genius, and I use that word loathingly, was the built-in protection. Law enforcement rarely stops funeral processions. There's a massive cultural taboo against it. Who wants to be the cop who interrupts a funeral? The cartel weaponized our own decency against us. They would drive these drug hearses down major interstates in broad daylight, decorated with memorial flowers and funeral home magnetic signs. Sometimes, they didn't even have a body. When they didn't have a legitimate transport, they'd create ghost deaths. They filed fraudulent death certificates for people who didn't exist or who had died years ago. They'd even fill sealed urns with drugs, claiming they were cremated remains. Once the DEA started pulling the thread, the whole sweater unraveled. The driver from the El Paso stop cooperated immediately, facing decades in prison. He gave up the names, the routes, and the contacts. Agents began 24-hour surveillance on the 23 funeral homes. They noticed hearses making quick turns, driving halfway across the country and returning within hours. That's not how funerals work. They subpoenaed records and found a mess. Death certificates that didn't match state records and billing for services never rendered. They also found a deeper layer of rot, corruption within the government. In Texas, a state inspector took $180,000 to ignore violations. In Arizona, a board administrator took $75,000 to falsify reports. But the real tragedy is the human cost. Imagine being the woman in Houston who found out that while she was driving alongside the hearse carrying her father's body, she was unknowingly acting as an escort for 30 pounds of cocaine. The betrayal is unspeakable. In April, the DEA launched coordinated raids. They arrested 67 people, owners, directors, drivers, and the corrupt officials. They even identified the mastermind in Mexico, a lieutenant for the Gulf Cartel known as El Funerario, the Undertaker. While he's still at large in Matamoros, the DEA has issued international warrants for his extradition. The funeral homes involved have been permanently shuttered. The owners who cooperated are getting reduced sentences, while those who fought are looking at 40 years in federal prison. This case has finally forced the industry's hand. For years, the National Funeral Directors Association resisted federal oversight. But after Operation Final Passage, Congress is moving on the Funeral Industry Transparency and Safety Act. It would finally require federal licensing and a national database to track these businesses. The DEA has also changed its training. Officers are now taught to look for the red flags of a fake funeral transport, nervous drivers, illogical routes, and questionable paperwork. Well, as we wrap this up, it leaves us with a haunting question. The DEA says the cartels weaponized our humanity. They counted on the fact that we wouldn't disturb the dead. One agent said it best. "I've seen submarines and tunnels, but using a grandmother's casket as a mule? That's a new level of evil." The 67 arrests were a massive victory, but the underlying vulnerability is still there. As long as we have interstate transport and a cultural respect for death, there will be a shadow trying to exploit it. What do you think about this? Should the police be more aggressive in searching funeral vehicles, or does that cross a line that we can't come back from? Let me know in the comments. The dignity of the dead was sold for $50,000 a trip. If you found this investigation eye-opening, check out our other deep dives on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.